In a cliffside cave in northern Israel, archaeologists found the remains of at least 28 people from a 12,000-year-old Natufian burial site. Most were placed in collective, reused burial pits. A few were buried differently. But one grave stood apart. An elderly, physically disabled woman had been placed alone in a specially prepared chamber, sealed beneath stone slabs, surrounded by tortoise shells, rare animal bones, and a human foot that did not belong to her body. Archaeologists have interpreted her as a possible shaman, perhaps one of the earliest ever identified. But even the excavator emphasized the same thing: this is an interpretation, not a fact. The woman belonged to the Natufian culture, hunter-gatherers who lived across the eastern Mediterranean roughly 15,000 to 11,500 years ago, right at one of the most significant turning points in human history. The Natufians were still primarily foragers, but they lived through the long transition toward farming, gathering and processing wild cereals, building semi-permanent settlements, and staying in certain places for much of the year before domesticated farming became the dominant basis of life in the region. That transition reshaped daily life, how people organized labor, how they related to land, and, evidently, how they understood death and the people who mattered most within their communities. Radiocarbon dating places the burial itself at roughly 12,000 years old, in the Late Natufian period. The cave where this woman was found is called Hilazon Tachtit, a small site in the western Galilee, excavated over more than a decade by archaeologist Leore Grosman and her team. They recovered the remains of at least 28 individuals there, most from a single collective burial area reopened repeatedly over generations. The site was not a palace, temple, or village cemetery in the later sense. It was a small cave whose careful use reveals how much social and ritual life had already changed before fully agricultural village life reshaped the region. What made this particular burial stand out was not wealth or scale. It was deliberate, careful construction, built in stages archaeologists could actually reconstruct from the layers themselves. First, a symmetrical oval pit was dug directly into the cave floor. Then it was lined with mud plaster and stone slabs, creating a sealed chamber rather than a simple hole in the ground. Large stones were positioned within the space itself, with grave goods placed carefully between them. Finally, the whole structure was closed with additional heavy stones, some placed directly on the body, apparently to hold it firmly in position and keep it from shifting within the sealed grave. Only 3 burials at the entire site were treated as primary, undisturbed interments rather than later collective secondary burial. Hers was the most elaborately constructed of all 3, by a clear margin. The woman herself was petite and elderly, roughly 45 years old at death. Her pelvis and lower spine showed clear signs of deformity, evidence she likely walked with a pronounced limp for most of her adult life. In a highly mobile society, such a condition would likely have affected how she moved, worked, and was perceived. Yet the grave suggests not marginal treatment, but extraordinary social attention. Then there are the grave goods, and this is where the burial becomes genuinely strange. Researchers recovered dozens of complete tortoise shells, at least around 50, and possibly more depending on the count method, carefully arranged beneath her skull, beneath her pelvis, and around the perimeter of the grave. That alone is unusual. Tortoise remains rarely appear in other Natufian burials at all. Alongside them were the nearly complete pelvis of a leopard, the wingtip of a golden eagle, the tailbone of wild cattle, or aurochs, the skulls of 2 stone martins, part of a wild boar positioned directly against her arm, a gazelle horn core placed with a broken basal bowl. And, strangest of all, a complete human foot belonging to a different, noticeably larger adult, its owner never identified. Several of these species were unusual in Natufian burial contexts and may have carried symbolic significance beyond ordinary food remains. Isotopic and butchery evidence recovered around the site also suggests a large communal feast involving the meat of dozens of tortoises and wild cattle, possibly among the earliest archaeological evidence for a funerary feast associated with a specific burial. So why call her a shaman specifically, rather than simply an important or respected community member? The term itself is borrowed from Siberian ethnography and refers to a ritual specialist believed to mediate between ordinary people and the spirit world, often through trance, symbolic association with particular animals, and specialized knowledge unavailable to the rest of the community. The word is useful, but also dangerous. It can make a prehistoric interpretation sound more certain and more familiar than it really is. Here, it means a possible ritual specialist inferred from burial treatment and grave goods, not a directly documented title, identity, or institution. Grosman and her colleagues argue that the specific combination of features here, rare and symbolically loaded animal parts, a body treated with unusual and elaborate care despite visible physical disability, and a burial constructed entirely differently from anyone else at the site, closely matches burial patterns anthropologists have documented for shamans and ritual specialists in far more recent, better understood societies around the world. Similar interpretive arguments always rest on comparison, not direct written testimony from the period itself. It is a careful comparative argument, built from analogy rather than proof. But Grosman herself has been direct about its limits, telling one interview, "I think this is the burial of a shaman." It is an interpretation, of course. They did not leave a note telling me. That honesty matters, because the word shaman carries a lot of cultural weight that the physical evidence alone cannot fully carry on its own. What the archaeology can actually establish is narrower, and in some ways more interesting. This specific individual, whose skeletal condition likely shaped how she moved through life, received the single most elaborate, resource-intensive burial found anywhere at this entire site. Someone made a deliberate, costly decision that her death deserved unusual grave construction, careful placement of rare animal remains, and a burial-associated communal feast that used food resources the group could otherwise have kept for themselves. That kind of costly investment is itself a form of evidence, even without a written record explaining the reasoning behind it. Whatever her actual social role during life, ritual specialist, healer, storyteller, mediator, memory keeper, or something with no clean modern equivalent at all, her community clearly believed she mattered enough in death to break from ordinary practice entirely, and to keep doing so through every stage of a genuinely elaborate process. The safest conclusion is still powerful, not that we know her title, but that her community treated her death as different. Comparable early ritual burials have since been identified elsewhere, including a double grave discovered at Bad Dürrenberg in central Germany, dated to roughly 1700 to 6800 BCE, containing an adult woman buried in a seated position together with an infant. Her grave goods included antler artifacts and 6 perforated boar tusks likely worn as ornaments, alongside stone and bone tools and red ochre. Recent ancient DNA analysis, published in 2023, revealed the infant was her direct descendant, several generations removed. Researchers studying the Bad Dürrenberg burial similarly stopped short of certainty, describing the individual as someone who likely held religious or medicinal significance rather than asserting the term shaman as an established, proven fact. Together, these finds suggest Hilazon Tachtit is not an isolated fluke, but part of a real, if still only partially understood, pattern in how early complex societies marked certain people as different, even sacred, specifically in death. None of this proves the Hilazon Tachtit woman performed rituals, entered trance states, or held any particular belief system that we could actually name today. Archaeology can recover behavior with real confidence. It cannot recover belief directly, no matter how carefully the physical evidence is read. What it offers instead is a rare window into a moment when a community's relationship to death, status, and the supernatural was changing, as people in the region moved through the long transition from foraging toward farming. We will never know this woman's actual name, her spoken words, or precisely what she believed about the world beyond her own. What survives is a grave built with extraordinary care, for someone her community judged extraordinary, 12,000 years before anyone had written down what a word like sacred even meant. That is not a small thing to leave behind, buried under stone in a quiet cave in the Galilee, waiting 12 millennia to be carefully uncovered again. It might be one of the oldest things human beings have ever tried to say to each other. Subscribe if you want to keep following the questions that do not have clean answers. See you in the dark.